Are y'all ready to get back into it? The Sermon on the Plain. Now, here's the question. Is this the same sermon as the Sermon on the Mount? Scholars are divided on this. Despite the differences between Matthew and Luke in their recording of the sermon, many believe that it really is the same sermon given from two different perspectives. And so you can call this the single sermon view versus the dual sermon view. Quite a few critical scholars suggest that neither discourse, whether representing the same group of sayings or not, actually represents an actual sermon. Instead, say many, these discourses are actually collations of various statements Jesus gave throughout the course of his ministry, with the geographical location of these sayings on a mountain or on a plain or on a level place being a narrative device to give them context. This view is called the Anthology view. We have obviously made a judgment call here, believing that Jesus did indeed preach two sermons with overlapping content on two different times, at least at two different locations. In that respect, he is not unlike many preachers living today. For us, the major differences between these passages strongly suggest that they do not certainly prove they were dealing with two events here. First of all, we have Matthew's significantly longer length. Luke's Beatitudes are coupled with woes. There are differences in narrative context, the plain versus the mountain. And Matthew is going to place his sermon long before he introduces us to the 12, whereas Luke has his sermon being the occasion of the choosing of the 12. Another narrative difference, to take a point from Bach, who defends the single sermon view, the sermon is Matthew's third event while it is Luke's 14th, though as Bach rightly notes, this could be due to Matthew's topical vis-a-vis Luke's more chronological approach to these issues. The sermons have different geographical contexts. A strong argument for the single sermon view is that 90% of Luke's sermon is found in Matthew's. And that's significant. And yet again, we maintain that even preachers today will deliver the same sermon twice. For us, the strongest argument for the single sermon view is that both Matthew and Luke tie their sermons to the healing of the centurion's servant, thereby suggesting that both are recording the same sermon. Then again, Matthew's centurion narrative does not immediately follow his sermon narrative, as does Luke's, and he has quite a few concentrated miracle stories immediately succeeding his recording of the sermon, ones that we believe occurred sometime later in Jesus' ministry. Matthew places these events early in his narrative to illustrate the fact that, like David and Moses, a king and a prophet, the Messiah Jesus speaks with authority and backs up his claims with signs and wonders. Okay, so Darrell Bach, who I hold in high esteem as a scholar, I studied the Gospel of Luke under him in seminary. He has a very good discussion of this. I disagree with him on this. I think these are two different sermons. But he would be a guy you can read to get the other perspective. At the end of the day, does it really matter? No. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. For the purpose of my harmony, though, I just wanted to make a judgment call here. And I do find it interesting that if things lay out the way I'm suggesting in this harmony, Jesus has chosen the 9th of Av or the 8th of Av to deliver this sermon. Now, what's significant about this time period? What's the 9th of Av? Anybody know what the 9th of Av is? It was on the 9th of Av that the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. And so this was a fast day for the Jews. Jewish tradition developed a fast day for this. So the reason I have Jesus delivering this on the 8th of Av is that Again, it's not impossible, but I don't imagine that he was going to pick a fast day to be the day that he would deliver this sermon. But why would he deliver a sermon like this on this day? Is to remind the Jews of the judgment that has occurred to them. And if I'm right, then there are reasons why the Sermon on the Plain takes on a different flavor, especially at the beginning, than the Sermon on the Mount. The conspiracy to kill him is now in motion. People are accusing him of working through demons. It's almost a year after he delivered the Sermon on the Mount. We're 2 months away from that anniversary. And we're still dealing with this kind of rejection that he experienced right after he delivered the Sermon on the Mount. And so Jesus is putting forth a warning. If you go down this road, you will be destroyed. And Luke is very keen to highlight the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to occur in the year 70. And do y'all know what day the Romans chose to actually go in and destroy Jerusalem? The 9th of Av. They picked the Babylonian anniversary. So Jerusalem was destroyed twice on the same day. In 586 BC on the 9th of Av, and AD 70 on the 9th of Av. And this is why on this day, corresponding as it does in August, you can go to the synagogue and they will be reading the book of Lamentations, which is the lament that Jeremiah gave as he overlooked the city as it was being destroyed by the Babylonians and wept over the city. Okay, so that's the background here. And this is part speculation and part fact, all right? So this is what I'm engaged in. Jesus came down with them, that is with the disciples, the 12, and stood on a level place. And there was a large crowd of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. And all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. And turning his gaze toward his disciples, he began to say, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Notice there's a difference here. The poor in spirit is how it's worded in Matthew. Here it's just, "Blessed are you who are poor." Okay? This is why I think that the primary focus of Jesus' sermon here is going to be physical judgment, the judgment of the nation. And one of the reasons why the nation of Israel was destroyed beforehand, according to the prophets, was the way the leadership treated the poor. The first sermon, Sermon on the Mount, is all Beatitudes, no woes, and it's gospel, and it's how you're made right with God and how you are to live in God's kingdom that he's established. That's all it's really about. Also reorienting us as to how to read Torah. A lot of those elements are missing here. And we don't have poor in spirit here. We just have poor. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be satisfied. Notice the physicality of this. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you and ostracize you and insult you and scorn your name as evil for the sake of the Son of Man. Be glad in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. That is the similarity. That's a parallel with Matthew. He gave that sentiment in Matthew. For in the same way their fathers used to treat the prophets. And then he gives his woes. But woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full. In other words, if all you care about is the riches of this life, congratulations, that's all you got. When you die, you lose everything. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. This reminds me when Jesus, according to Luke, when Jesus is going through the city during his passion and he's carrying the cross, he will fall on his knees and women will come up and they are weeping over him, and they're wiping the blood from his face. And what does he say to them? Don't weep for me, weep for yourselves. And he's predicting the judgment upon Jerusalem. This is a very strong theme in Luke's gospel. The Olivet Discourse in Luke will concentrate on the Romans surrounding Jerusalem. In Matthew and Mark, it's the eschaton, the end of days. So again, woe to you, laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for their fathers used to treat the false prophets in the same way. Who was well thought of most in Isaiah's day? Ahaz or Isaiah? Ahaz. The elders, the royalty, they were the ones that were given all the credit. But when we read about Ahaz, what do we think? Well, he's a wicked king, one of the most wicked in Israel. Okay. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. And whoever takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High. For he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. I'm going to read some of this, but I want to stop here for a minute and highlight one of these, what may stick out as a troubling command. He says, whoever takes what is yours, do not demand it back. Is Jesus endorsing stealing here? Somebody breaks into your house and takes your whatever. Should you demand it back? Yes. That's right. He's talking in the context of friendships, for example, where a friend lends something to another and the friend keeps it longer than expected. You were not to bring in the police and have that person arrested. Um, he's not talking about someone who sneaks onto your property and steals your car, and you are just not to go report that to the police or anything like that. If you lend Tanner your DVD, and Tanner says, okay, I'll give it back to you next time we meet, and he forgets it, that's one thing. If Tanner broke into your home and stole the DVD, then I think Tanner should be reprimanded for that. I think we're all clear on this. I think all of us have had something lent to us and we forgot to give it back on time. I have. I'll go ahead and I'll confess. I have. But I've not broken into someone's house to steal something. I have a friend who was he had a he had a niece. He married into a family, and the family that he married into, his wife's niece, her husband, uh, when he was out of town, broke into his home and stole the family's silver, took it to a pawn shop. He had this business deal that he wanted to secure. So he took the money to secure the business deal, and the whole thing went kaput, and he wasn't able to get the silver back before they came back in town. Should my friend have gotten angry, or should he have just said, "Oh, Jesus says for me not to worry about it when people take things"? No, he had my friend had the right. He actually was extremely gracious to him, which amazed me. But he had the right to be angry with his nephew for doing this to him. He had the right to be angry. Now he wasn't, amazingly, but I would have been very angry, especially not even the monetary value of the silverware, but it was the sentimental value. This was passed down generations into her family. This meant a lot to her, his wife. The Sermon on the Plain begins in a similar way as the Sermon on the Mount with the offer of gospel blessing. However, unlike the previous sermon, blessing is accompanied with woe. Hence, the typology of the Sermon on the Mount connects Jesus to Moses' delivery of the law on Mount Sinai. The typology of the Sermon on the Plain connects Jesus to the blessings and curses given to the people of God on Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, respectively. If we were correct in our chronology, the timing cannot be more apropos. The Sermon on the Mount introduced the gospel, the foundation of the law, and the one who interprets the Torah for the people of God. In short, it is a manual for kingdom living. Almost 1 year later, 10 months later, it is clear that the leadership of Judea and the surrounding Jewish regions is rejecting Jesus' message. Remember, some, at least, have suggested that he's working through demons, and many of the leadership are conspiring to kill him. So Jesus chooses the 8th of Av as the occasion to deliver the sermon, which, again, is approaching the anniversary of the destruction of Jerusalem. In Deuteronomy, the nation pronounced curse before blessing. Jesus reverses it. In contrast to the covenantal promises of the people, he begins with blessing while warning with woe, as if to say that he is stretching out his hand to bless them. That they would only trust in him, their Messiah, and follow his commands and live according to the law, not as a means of justification, but as a means of sanctification. They would, as a nation, avert judgment and become the headquarters of his kingdom on earth. Unfortunately, his promises, his warnings, and his repeated exhortations fall on deaf ears, even with a large crowd, possibly numbering in the hundreds. Notice that Luke is summarizing the principles laid down in Jesus' sermon, and yet there are interesting contrasts which suggest that we are not reading the Sermon on the Mount here. For example, the principles, while there, are not greatly expounded upon, suggesting that Jesus is giving his message to an audience that needs to be reminded more than taught. Notice also Jesus' words, "Be merciful, just as your Father in heaven is merciful." While this in no way contradicts what we see in the Sermon on the Mount, it is strikingly distinct, rather, from "be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." It is almost as if Jesus is here in the Sermon on the Plain clarifying what he meant by the latter saying, we cannot emulate God's incommunicable attributes like self-existence or immutability or eternity, but we can emulate his communicable attributes to some analogous degree, like his holiness or his justice or his mercy. Now, my question to all of you is, who here is not familiar with the statement or the phrase incommunicable attributes or communicable attributes? Who here is not familiar with that? You're not familiar with that? Right. When we speak of God's incommunicable attributes, we're talking about those attributes that the creature cannot share in. And these are attributes for which there's no analogy because they are almost always negative. So we call this sometimes negative theology. So aseity means that God exists from himself. That's an incommunicable attribute. We can't be self-existent. Or immutable, that's a negative attribute. God does not change. We do. So God can't communicate those attributes to us in any way, shape, or form. The positive attributes like holiness or mercy or justice or goodness of various kinds, God can communicate that to us. Be holy as I am holy. And what Jesus is calling us to do is he's calling us to be merciful. How do we manifest the perfection of God most clearly in our lives? Mercy. He begins his sermon with warnings of just judgment, and yet even they are preceded with the proclamation of mercy. I infer from this that we are to emulate God's perfection to the degree a finite creature is able to do so, and the one perfection that we are to emulate most is mercy. For this is the heart of the Torah, especially regarding how we are to interact with one another in interpersonal relationships. The Lord is exhorting us to be merciful, not merely show it. In this respect, the blessing of a good character as one who is a gracious person to those with whom he comes into contact is the end game of Christian ethics. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that our Lord is endorsing what we now call virtue ethics. The idea that the whole point of doing ethics, being a good person, is that you as a character, your character, what you are is good. So the end game of God's law is to create good people. Okay. All right. Any questions about that or thoughts? No. He goes on to say this: do not judge, and you will not be judged, and do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Excuse me. Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. Note that Jesus is presented here as a teacher of wisdom, thereby resembling the kinds of exhortations we read about in Old Testament wisdom literature. This is not a pattern of living whereby we earn our salvation, but a lifestyle that earns us reward, grace and respect and trust and loyalty from those around us. As these are examples of wisdom sayings or wisdom literature, we are not to take these as absolutes, at least in the sense that we will always receive blessing for doing good. Sometimes sticking with one's principles results in persecution and even death. Jesus has just said this to his hearers. In the context of the sermon, he says, blessed are those who revile you and persecute you for my name's sake. What is the characteristic of a follower of Jesus? Somebody who manifests these characteristics. The characteristic of mercy, or not judging too harshly, etc., etc. So if that's our characteristic, but he also gives a blessing to those who are persecuted for his name's sake, clearly he's not saying that every single time you go out and do these things, you're going to get this immediate reward from those around you. That's not how it works. These are general principles. Hence, we are promised here blessings in this life in the long run, and as a general point, insofar as we exemplify a godly character. His moral exhortations, like those of the whole of Scripture, are therefore not meant to be abused by the Christian. May a follower of Christ never say, while suffering a dark providence, that he has tried to live a life pleasing to God, and so should not experience this, whatever this is. I shouldn't be going through this. I've done everything you've told me to do, God, and why is this happening to me? We're promised that this will happen to you. What is the this you're talking about, Travis? You fill in the blank. People are gossiping about you at work, or people are abusing you in some way, or even worse things like the loss of a loved one, even though you prayed for them. These things happen. We are to do the right thing no matter what the immediate consequences are, clinging to the promise that in the end, our character will be vindicated in our community, and if not, at least by the Lord himself. And one of the most important things you can ask while you're going through this is, what kind of character will I manifest in the midst of this trial? Because you can't control those circumstances, but you can control you. That's the issue. At least that's what I've tried to remind myself whenever I've gone through such things. Any questions or thoughts about what I've just said? He also spoke a parable to them. A blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Will they not both fall into a pit? A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone, after he has been fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your eye? Or how can you say to your brother, brother, let me take that speck out that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck that is in your brother's eye. For there is no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor on the other hand a bad tree which produces good fruit. For each tree is known by its fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a briar bush. The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. Now, this section, in my opinion, vindicates our earlier contention, which we gave while we were commenting on the Sermon on the Mount, that while Jesus' discussion of good fruit chiefly concerns how we discern who is and who is not a good teacher, there is a legitimate secondary application of the principle, which is to say that every person must inspect his own fruit, which is a sign as to whether he does or does not belong to God. And why does this section vindicate our contention there? Because in Luke's Sermon on the Plain, there's no discussion of good and bad teachers. How do you discern the good teacher from the bad teacher? Jesus doesn't mention that here in the Sermon on the Plain. This is another contrast. He's actually asking everyone in his audience to do that to themselves. What kind of fruit are you producing? If you're producing bad fruit, then you're a bad tree. And the qualifier as to this is the standard whereby we judge good and bad teachers is not there. Why am I saying this? Because there are teachers, there are theologians who want to divorce fruit from assurance. They want to say that your assurance has nothing to do with the good or bad fruit that you're producing. And they will run to Matthew and say, see, he's talking about how you discern good and bad teachers. But he's not talking about teachers here. He's talking about us, all of us. Everyone who's hearing this sermon, inspect your fruit. And if your fruit is bad and evil, that may indicate that you don't belong to God. He then goes on to say, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts on them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock, and when a flood occurred, the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who has heard and has not acted accordingly is like a man who built a house on the ground without any foundation, and the torrent burst against it, and immediately it collapsed, and the ruin of that house was great. He ends this sermon in much the same way he ends the Sermon on the Mount, Luke does not comment on the authority with which he preached, but clearly many of the same sentiments that he had given in the prior sermon he gives here, not the least of which is his endorsement of those who call him Lord, Lord. You come to me and you say, Lord, Lord. What is that double phrase, that double kurios or kuri? What does that refer to? His deity. He is claiming to be deity here. What's consistency? Calling him Lord, Lord, and doing everything he says, which also means believing everything Jesus believes. All right, so we've finished the Sermon on the Plain. Any questions? It is so short compared to the Sermon on the Mount. And of course, I didn't feel like I had to give a full commentary on everything in the Sermon on the Plain because we've already commented on it in the Sermon on the Mount. But Wednesday afternoon, on the same day, he heals a pagan. So when he had completed all of his discourse in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum, and a centurion slave who was highly regarded by him was sick and about to die. And when he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his slave. And when they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, and they are employing him through a message of the centurion, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. And they, the messenger, said, he is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue. And so Jesus says, well, I will come and heal him. Now, Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason, I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. In that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, go, it shall be done for you as you believed. And the servant was healed that very hour. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. I'm not going to read through all my comments here, except to say I find this curious. Matthew, when he gives the story, it's almost as if the centurion is there. Whereas through Luke, we learn that the centurion actually sent servants. Matthew is doing what we call compressing the narrative. He's giving a shorter version because if I say Hitler invaded Poland, I think all of you understand that Hitler himself did not go into Poland, right? And in the same way, the centurion spoke with Jesus, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the centurion himself actually spoke to Jesus. But it is as if he spoke to Jesus. It's as good as if he spoke to Jesus, and so Matthew is obviously not lying to us. Now, why do we think that Luke is giving the full scoop and Matthew's compressing the narrative? Because Luke is actually showing us that the story plays out exactly as the centurion is suggesting. In other words, the story itself illustrates the centurion's point. I know when my servants, if I ask them to do something, they're going to do it. And so I don't have to question them. And so if I send a servant to go here and say, hey, give this message to Jesus, they're going to do it. It's as good as if I'm doing it myself. What may be interesting is that, and I'm speculating here a little bit, but it may be that they've taken a written note and they've read it to Jesus. And then Jesus flipped the note on the back and wrote his answer. to the centurion, maybe in a little note to him. Do I know that that happened? No. But I kind of like to think that that's the way it happened, because I like the idea of the servants going, when was he healed? And the note is indicating the servant was healed exactly when the note said. But whether that is all true or not, some people have said, well, this is the same story as the official who worked for Herod Antipas back in John 4, where we have Jesus. He's not in Capernaum, he's in Cana. And you'll remember that a person from Capernaum comes to him, the official does, and Jesus says, your servant is healed. And he doesn't have to go to Capernaum to see the to see the person to heal him. Most scholars do not believe, they don't believe that these are the same story. For one, the official that comes to Jesus in John 4, that official is Jewish. He works for Herod, and he's the steward of Herod. I believe that that official was Cusa, and that his wife Joanna is going to start following Jesus. She's probably already following him at this point. And it was her son that was healed. But whoever this official was, it was his son that was healed. In this case, we're talking about a Gentile Roman centurion whose servant is healed. So it's a different story altogether. And the point of this story is it's giving a foreshadowing of Jesus' impact on the Gentiles. The Gentiles are going to start coming in droves because they will manifest a greater faith in the God of Israel than the Jews, which is interesting in and of itself. But here's what I think all of us should really take away with this story. The Jesus of Matthew and Luke is the same Jesus as the Jesus of John. Because in both stories, we have an example of Jesus healing from a distance. His mere word heals. And so the same portrait of Jesus that's given here in this story is the same portrait given in John 4. It's a different healing, but it's the same power. In John, the whole point is he is the Word of God, therefore his word heals. Here, he is opening the door to Gentiles. And that Gentile who placed his faith in Jesus is just as much saved as the woman who came crying to him at his feet, or any of the other Jews that we've been talking about. Okay. Any thoughts about this? Nothing? Wednesday, the 15th of Av, AD 31. This is August 22nd is how I'm dating it. Jesus raises the dead for a second time. So this is a second resurrection or resuscitation. And it came about soon afterwards that he went to a city called Nain. And his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. Now, as he approached the city, the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a sizable crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came up and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." This report concerning him went out all over Judea and all the surrounding district. Okay. Since Josephus never mentions Nain in his work, some skeptics have asserted that the location of the story is just a literary device. Darrell Bach refutes this with the following. He says, mentioned only here in the Bible, Nain was a little town and appears to be located at the site of the modern town of Nain, or Nine, N-E-I-N, which now has about 200 residents, located in Galilee, 3 miles west of Endor, 20 miles southwest of Capernaum, and 6 miles southeast of Nazareth. Nain, or Nine, sits at the foot of so-called Little Hermon over the valley of Jezreel. Now, Bach goes on to say that there are other possible locations, but this is the most likely one. I do point out that the disciples here may refer to all of Jesus' disciples, in which case the large crowd following is even more people. But I tend to think that from this point forward, whenever he mentions the disciples, he's almost always talking about the 12, unless he specifies otherwise. And so I think the disciples in the large crowd would be all of his followers together. So we're talking about, again, like 80 people or so. Now, if this is a small town of, say, 100 to 200 people, then the 80 people that Jesus is leading into Nain, they constitute most of the witnesses to this miracle. So why is Jesus picking this time to show his disciples that he can raise the dead? Remember, he's already done this once, but it was cloaked in ambiguity, right? Jairus' daughter was called asleep. We were told that she was just sleeping. And so some people probably took that as he just raised or helped heal a very sick girl. Others who actually witnessed the miracle know that he raised the dead. He said, don't go tell this to anybody. But now he's walked into a very, very small village, and he raises the dead. Why do that here, and why to such a small crowd? Why is it that the disciples of Jesus are virtually the only witnesses to this miracle? Disciples, of course, making up of about 80 people, to be sure, but why this miracle now? Almost a year later, 10 months later, something like that, 9 months later. Anybody want to take a guess? Uncomfortable silence. Right. That I think that's great. Now, it does raise the question, though. Why not just go around and just start doing this more and more and more? I find it interesting that Jairus' daughter, her resuscitation is cloaked in sort of a mystery. Here, he does it in a more public setting, but again, the majority of the people that saw this were probably just the family members of this young man, and then the disciples. So it's a very small crowd, relatively speaking, that sees it. It's not like he goes to a funeral procession in Jerusalem and performs the resurrection. He does it here. Yes. That's a possibility. If that's true, then he's raising a Gentile on the heels of, or around the context of him healing a Centurion servant. And, I'll be honest with you, I've not even really thought of that until you mentioned it, but that would make a lot of sense. It's a Gentile that he's raising. And I'm going to do more research into that. It's 20 miles from Capernaum, and it's in the valley of Jezreel, so it could be close to a sort of mostly Gentile outlet. It could be a mixture of Gentiles that witness it. So in any case, yeah, that's a really good point. Anybody else? Why is this so important for the widow? Notice she's a widow and she's lost her only child. This woman is destitute. She is not going to be able to survive. And these days, she's probably an elder woman. This is a young man. I'm speculating he's in his 20s. He was her only source of comfort and sustenance. His death was going to be devastating to her. So, again, the picture is clear. We are as destitute as that widow, and we are as dead as that young man. All of us. We are that widow. We are that young man. And Jesus' word of power resuscitates the man. Why do I keep using the word resuscitate, by the way? Yeah, we make a clear distinction between resurrection and resuscitation. Jesus is called the first fruits of the resurrection. And as the first fruits, he's going to be raised never to die again. This is a resuscitation. The young man, Jairus' daughter, these people are all going to die again. And so they are resuscitated. But obviously, this is a picture of resurrection. This is a picture of being raised from the dead. Jesus has this power. One of the interesting features is that in Jairus's daughter's case, this is a private affair that occurred before Peter, James, and John, and the parents. So there were 5 witnesses to Jairus' daughter being raised. And to the larger crowd, it was ambiguous as to whether she was asleep and she was just very sick, or whether sleeping is a euphemism for death. And so people interpreted that word differently. And I think one of the reasons why Jesus wanted it to be cloaked in ambiguity is A, his full power to raise the dead was not fully, he wasn't ready for that to be appreciated, or else people would just flock to him like crazy to do these things. But also because it is a private setting, there was no way to fully verify whether she was dead or not. It's not like you had a physician there. But I can assure you that when a person was in a funeral procession lying in a coffin, their death was already fully vindicated. In other words, there was no question that this person was dead. And so he picks a relatively obscure village, possibly overpopulated by Gentiles, as few as there were anyway. And he picks a time where in a public setting where everyone knows that the person is dead. And notice he doesn't say, don't share this with anybody, because it happens to, in front of a lot of people. And he actually raises a person who's clearly dead. I think that now that the Herodians and the Pharisees are conspiring with each other, now that his credentials as a miracle worker have been questioned, to wit, he works through demons, I think he wants to make it more public that I have this power, but not so public that it obscures from his mission. Because as far as we know, there's going to be only one more resurrection, resuscitation, and that's going to be Lazarus. And he does that in a very public way, just before he comes in to Jerusalem to declare himself the Messiah to the people. Here is off the beaten path, but it's public enough to where those who might question whether he's working through the devil will not question him. Why? Why does this silence anybody who would suggest that he works through the devil? The devil does not bring life. Over and over and over again, and actually we illustrated this with Jairus' daughter, but the Old Testament says God alone has the power to give resurrection life. And so Jesus is again demonstrating his deity here in the raising of the son of the widow of Nain. Okay. We're actually getting to the end, boys and girls. We only have two more stories to go. And then the content in this course is over. The plan for tomorrow is for me to just do a broad survey of different arguments against the kind of like what I did with the virgin birth last semester. Looking at attempts to show that there are contradictions, there are factual errors. For me to do a similar thing like that, just overviewing things. But we have two more stories, and then it will be time for us to stop. So where are we? We're at 10:38. Why don't we take a 5-minute break